that's necessary. So in terms of what is ADHD, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on a lot of the different disorders I've talked about, because really the goal of tonight is to talk about ways to help kids thrive, but having just a real basic understanding of some of these can be really helpful. So ADHD, it's classified as a neurodevelopmental disorder. And basically the main things to think about are trouble with attention, as well as sometimes impulsivity and hyperactivity. And again, there's some more subtle things with it related to executive function I'll get into in a minute that are also helpful to keep in mind. So what is executive functioning? So it's interesting because people throw this term around a lot. I don't know, I'd say the last maybe 3-4 years or more, all of a sudden I feel like I see it everywhere. But what's interesting is people don't really take, oftentimes people, executive function this, executive functioning that, but sometimes people don't actually know what executive functioning is. And so it's helpful to think about it. So one way of understanding it is think about an analogy of let's say a car factory. So a car factory obviously makes the finished product of a car. So you probably have a control room that's navigating, let's say, the different robots or machines, a conveyor belt. So you're putting, let's say, the wheels together, the windshield, all the different parts that go together to make a car. So essentially, if you think about executive functioning, it's kind of the control center of the mind. So you're essentially planning, organizing, doing whatever you have to do to essentially create a finished product or a completion of a task. In terms of breaking it down a little bit more, on here in the slide are a couple of different categories that comprise executive functioning. For any of you that have had testing done, some of these may look very familiar because these are actually the categories for a measure called the Brief 2, which is a self-report and parent report or teacher report form for executive functioning, but I think they do a good job of breaking it down. That cognitive regulation, which involves planning, task initiation, the idea of getting started, those are things that people often think about with executive functioning. But the other pieces that are not always as focused on are emotional control is connected to it, as well as attention and inhibition. So stopping yourself from acting on your impulses. So if you have a child that I know is on the computer and they say, "Oh, I want to go on to play this game," and they just can't stop themselves from going off whatever's going on in class and jumping in a game, that relates to trouble with inhibition. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have any sort of form of disorder just because they do that. But obviously, if you look at the context of everything else, certainly that could be a problem. Okay, some of these things here may be very self-explanatory in terms of how issues with attention and executive functioning can cause trouble with school, but sometimes it may seem obvious to one person, it's not always obvious to everyone, so it's always good just to kind of take a step back and look at some of these things. So certainly with attention, that can be one thing. If you have trouble staying focused, you're going to have a difficult time staying on task. You may miss instructions, either things that are visual or auditory things. When you're having to do independent work, it may be hard. I think with online learning, one of the things that's also very different is if there's things you're doing that are not part of the teacher watching you, and it's just time sort of off the screen doing independent work, depending on what's going on at home, there may be absolutely no one watching you whatsoever. And so the child or teen may be on their own with no one sort of monitoring them, having to have that internal motivation to stay on task. With executive functioning issues, trouble getting started on work, is a huge one. So the idea of procrastination, basically, thinking, "Oh, I have all this time in the world to do it," and then all of a sudden the deadlines approach, or deadlines passed. Trouble keeping track of assignments. What's really interesting is if you think about it, especially with online learning, most schools have some sort of online platform. So, for example, mine's just Classroom for the county. One's like Final Say, Schoology. They're all fairly similar in that they usually list the assignments and sometimes Zoom links. But one of the things that's interesting is just because everything's online and it's there doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to be able to find it easily and be able to go step by step to get to it. Because sometimes, I spend a lot of my day working with kids on My Assist Classroom, and sometimes it's a lot of different steps to click to get to the right assignment. And so I think those are important things to think about. Whether someone has an actual issue with executive functioning or not, sometimes things just are not very simple. In terms of learning disorders, again, I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail with this, but just the things to maybe keep in mind are that if someone has a learning issue, it may impact their reading accuracy, their speed. So it may take someone a really long time to do reading, or they may have a hard time with understanding what they're reading. With math, that can impact speed of completion, trouble with reasoning, number sense, writing. This is one that it's hard because sometimes executive functioning issues can definitely impact writing. But so you have trouble, let's say, getting started or organizing ideas. There's a lot of different aspects of writing that are at play that can sometimes, cause trouble. Language disorders. I mean, those are actually really interesting because a lot of times, because I do testing as well, half my practice is testing, half is treatment. So I get to sort of see it from both sides. And what's interesting is that I found a lot of times there are oftentimes like very subtle language disorders that go undiagnosed that, especially if a child had no history, let's say in preschool, of any language services or need for it, sometimes there end up being comprehension issues or other language production issues that just, they were subtle enough that never got picked up. But, at the high school level, they all of a sudden are causing significant issues. Anxiety is obviously another big one. Certainly, and I think with the pandemic, it adds a whole nother layer of it that we have not only, the normal anxiety that people experience, but on top of it, whether it's anxiety about having to show their face on camera or anxiety about just feeling uncomfortable about germs or, being online all day or, for kids that are going to some sort of hybrid model, sometimes anxiety about being in person. There's lots of different reasons for anxiety. And it's just, it's a whole nother element of navigating the new type of anxiety that may be present from the pandemic. Depression, obviously, trouble can lead to trouble concentrating, fatigue. What's interesting is if you think about it, especially think about anxiety, depression, ADHD. Sorry, it's a bit. Okay, so think about anxiety, depression, ADHD. So all of them actually can involve trouble focusing. So in some ways, you end up with the same end result. But obviously the reason for the trouble focusing is very different. Okay, so now we're getting into the nitty gritty of what we're going to talk about. Now that I've given enough of a background, we're going to talk about how to improve academic functioning. So the first thing, regardless of whatever the issue is, well, you want to figure out what is the issue to start, because otherwise you're going to throw random interventions that may or may not work. So you want to actually identify what is the actual issue that's going on that's causing the problem with learning. And so in order to treat it, then it might be psychotherapy, medication, tutoring, coaching, or, lifestyle changes. I mean, no matter whether someone's doing well in school or not, or in general, eating healthy, regular physical exercise, sufficient sleep, all of these things are really crucial for anyone. But if someone is already have a predisposition and struggling in some way, adjusting things certainly can't hurt, and in a lot of cases can probably help. I mean, if you look at a teen, again, the sleep may be a little bit different. And I think kids overall are getting somewhat more sleep now because school's often starting later. But if you look at someone that's gotten 4 or 5 hours sleep for a couple of days, chances are they're probably going to have a hard time focusing just because of the fact they're tired. So a lot of that may in turn actually mimic, ADHD or, sometimes other things, or could sometimes heighten anxiety or other issues. In some cases, kids do need formal support at school, which can be helpful, like a 504 plan or an IEP. And those are definitely very helpful sometimes, but a lot of it depends also on what they're given and how it's actually implemented. Because it's great to have something on paper, but if it's not actually implemented in a way that's useful, it's really not as helpful overall. The other big one, which is really what we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation, is really about tools and strategies that either your child or teen can use themselves or that you can use to help your child or teen, as well as collaboration with different people that your child's working with. So in terms of the teachers, if there's a tutor or a therapist, whoever's involved, really just trying to work on that collaboration is really crucial. Okay, so since we're talking about trying to thrive in school and big part of this organization, I figured I would try to keep us as organized as possible. So over here is kind of essentially a creative outline of what we're going to be focusing on in terms of organization, time management, reducing distractions, harnessing fidgeting, which is definitely one of my favorites to talk about. And I have a lot of props and stuff I'll show you guys in a few minutes for that, as well as a couple of study tools and some other ways for improving academic skills. So let's focus in on the first thing that we're going to talk about in terms of organization. Okay, so the key things with organization are that you really want to have your child or teen have all assignments listed in one place that they can easily access. So in addition to whatever is in the school portal, if your child or teen can't view the portal and easily plan from that, you probably want to have some other method. For younger kids, maybe, kids of any age could do a whiteboard, a paper list, a paper planner. But, especially for kids that don't have to do as much planning, something as, fairly simple can work very well. You could even have, someone in kindergarten could definitely use a whiteboard. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. I think as you get older, more planning needs to be involved. But, that can be really helpful for, especially right now. There are a lot of electronic planner options that can be really helpful, like My Homework or My Study Life. These are probably good for kids, middle to late elementary school and onwards, because some of them, for example, My Homework, you can actually, a little known trick with some of the school portals like MindSys Classroom or Schoology is that if there's a calendar link. So for MindSys Classroom example, there's a button that says calendar feed. If you go under the calendar section, that allows you to copy the link that has all of the assignments, and you can put it on your own calendar or your child or teen's calendar. So for example, if you don't want to keep wading through MindSys Classroom to see what assignments your child has, you could actually just copy and paste the link, and then you get it on whatever calendar you use normally, and you can see it all. And so because of that, you can use some of these programs, like My Homework, for example, and it'll basically put all of the assignments into a nice list for you, and you can prioritize them by priority, by due date. So it gives a lot of flexibility. So it gives you kind of a nice, simple list of everything without all the extraneous kind of clutter that you sometimes get from seeing it in a portal. Plus, one of the other big things, if you think about it, so if you're manually typing in assignments or it's automated, you're at least seeing just what you need. Whereas when you're going through a school portal to look for the assignments, there's a lot of pages that you have to get to. Or you might, if it's set up in a way where you have to look at each class separately, your child may, after class 3 or 4, forget to look at the rest of the classes. So by having everything in one place, it'll make it a lot easier for planning. For younger kids, I mean, if they don't need as comprehensive of a planner program, you could use, certainly, as I said, a whiteboard, something on paper. If you want to use something electronic, something that can be really helpful is Google Tasks. So Google Tasks actually is interesting because it's a fairly simple task list app, but it's actually already built into stuff that if your child uses a Google for Education account, like for example, Montgomery County students all have them, you basically open it up and it's built into the email account. And then if you get an email that says, so-and-so's added a new assignment, you can click a button and it automatically adds the assignment to a task list for you. So it's kind of cool because you're basically having them use something that they're already using, or it's built into what they're already using, so it makes it easier. Because the other big thing with the organization is ultimately you want to help your kids to do as much of this themselves as you can. You don't want to be the one having to constantly monitor them and say, did you do this? Did you do that? Because quite frankly, that probably get annoying for both of you. So the idea is by giving them the tools to organize themselves, and that's the other stuff that we'll talk about, it can really help them to do a lot more themselves, so you can kind of take a step back. Like, especially for younger kids, there probably needs to be more oversight. But the idea is over time, as they can demonstrate that they can keep track of the assignments and get them done themselves, you probably don't have to monitor them quite as closely, which is the ultimate goal. In addition to having knowing all the assignments, especially for older kids, you probably want to help them to make a daily plan. Because if they have, like for example, in the county, they have obviously whatever class you have on Monday and in the middle school and high school, whatever classes you have on Monday and Thursdays, you have a couple days between to do the assignments. And so you want to think about, if you get an assignment on Monday, are you going to do it Monday night? Are you going to do it on Tuesday? Are you going to do it sometime during the day Wednesday? Are you going to do it at the last minute on Thursday? But by basically writing a list each day of what assignments you're going to work on, it can help keep you better organized. The other big thing with it that's really helpful is to make time estimations. Because let's say I had, 8 assignments I need to do. If I have absolutely no idea how long they might take, it probably makes it really hard to plan accurately. It could take me 20 minutes, it could take me 5 hours, it could take me 10 hours, which really isn't helpful, because if I have, 2 hours free for homework, I probably want to maximize that time and I want to plan accordingly. So by creating the time estimations, it helps people to figure out for themselves, what's actually feasible. Because if you make a plan and there's no way it's even possible, kids are going to get discouraged and probably not keep doing it. So with a plan, you want to figure out how do you make a plan that you can actually stick to, but also obviously there needs to be some room for flexibility. But by sort of planning it out, and the key also is writing it out. For a lot of people will just look at the school portal, say, these are my assignments, this is what I'm going to work on. But the act of actually writing it out really can make a big difference in planning better and staying better organized with it. Okay, and the idea of a daily plan. So it's a little different with online school. Sometimes a daily plan, you may want to include the classes and breaks and things like that into the day. So here's an example of a daily plan that has a couple of classes in it, but I want to draw your attention to a few things. So one of them is the breaks. So not only did I list out the breaks, but I put the specific activity in. And so as you may notice, for example, the 15-minute break at 11 a.m. is push-ups and sit-ups. So the idea behind it is that it forces you to have so you have a set activity, it gets you away from the computer, and it's also something active. And also if you say, I'm going to do, 20 push-ups and 10 sit-ups, it also is time limited. Because what that does is it gives you a set activity to do during the break. You could do the same thing with, a walk around the block if it's safe to do so, running a loop around your backyard, But the idea is you hopefully have some sense of how long that would take. I mean, theoretically, you could do it on a computer with, let's say, if you have 15 minutes, you could probably watch a 10-minute YouTube video and know that you're going to finish in time. But that obviously keeps you in front of the computer. But it's the same principle. That by having a time-limited break, it helps you to stay on task, and your child or teen is less likely to lose track of time and miss the next class. The plan here in the afternoon and evening shows a couple of assignments listed with the estimated completion time. And so again, the idea is by figuring out how much time things are likely to take, it can help you to plan better. And for kids that really have no sense of how long something takes, a great strategy is to actually have them use a timer and keep track of how long assignments take. Because let's say with math homework, if you get roughly the same type of math sheet every day or every time you have math class, and it's the same amount of problems, chances are it probably takes somewhat similar amount of time to do. So if you've actually recorded it and you figure out, oh, it takes me about 20 to 30 minutes, then you can actually have a very realistic time estimation going forward. And it helps people to also be more mindful and think about the time. Because a lot of times kids rush to get things done, but really have no clue how long things actually take. Same thing, and a lot of these principles we're talking about, work with adults as well for different things. Thinking about how when you check email, how long does it take to check email and typically respond when you wake up in the morning to things? Or if you have to, write up notes for a weekly meeting you have, chances are it might take roughly the same amount of time, but you might not always think about how long do I actually need to allot to have enough time for it. Okay, in terms of physical organization, so this is one that I do think actually differs a fair amount sometimes when school is online. In part because depending on your child's age and the requirements of the school, you may actually have far fewer papers than you normally would. So using binders, folders, it doesn't matter as much what you're doing as long as it's something that's organized, so that your child or teen can easily find papers and not lose stuff. So if there's any sort of homework assignments that need to be handed in, like a scan, for example, having a folder where you put all the homework in that needs to be scanned in. Or if it's, let's say, writing things you have to keep track of, putting all the writing assignments in chronological order in a folder. And, starting kids, young, even in kindergarten, having a folder for each class and putting stuff in chronologically can help train kids to do it themselves, because that's the ultimate goal. You probably don't want to spend your evenings organizing your child's papers. Because quite frankly, I'm sure everyone has enough to do without, doing all their kids' work as well. So again, and the other thing I would say too is that not just physical organization, but think about your child's computer files. With Google Drive, for example, unless it's something that the teacher has, sent the Google Doc and they save it, chances are your child Google Drive, unless they put folders in, probably just has a million documents in it without any organization. So being able to help kids from a young age to have a folder for each class, and then maybe a subfolder for, exam prep or paper, something to just make sure that it's really easy to find stuff when they need to go back to it, can be really helpful. And as strange as this sounds, a lot of kids don't actually title documents in Google Drive for some reason. So it's a good idea to really help kids to just make sure you at least title the documents in a way so if you do have to search for it, you can actually find it. Okay, so in terms of time management, so certainly I mentioned planning a little bit before. In addition to making an actual plan, having a set routine each day can be really helpful. So for example, having a set time of day to start, having a routine of pulling out a planner if you're using one, double checking against the online portal, finalizing your daily plan and completing homework, those things can be really helpful. But the idea is also it's about the routine. So getting your child into doing the same thing each day will also in turn help them to follow through more on their own. Whereas if, let's say, the school day ends, let's say 3:15, and at that point, sometime before 8 o'clock at night, they get their homework done, probably there's less incentive to try to get it done at a certain time if they don't have an actual plan of what they're striving for. So by having a set time, that in itself can help to get homework done. The big thing I'll say in general is it's also important to make sure that you work collaboratively with your child or teen to set some of these things within reason. Like if you tell your child, you have to do homework this time, you have to do this, you have to do that, chances are you're probably not going to get much buy-in, and they may just get really annoyed and may cause a lot of fights. So within reason, like being able to say, give your child some autonomy in deciding, do I do my homework right after school? Do I get an hour break? Like have some reasonable parameters over your expectations, but giving them, even from an age, some autonomy in this. And you could also try it out with the agreement. If it doesn't work, we'll try it a different way. Those things can go a long way in helping kids to really learn to do these things for themselves. In terms of reducing distractions, And and again, most of these things probably are really relevant for adults as well. Is certainly, if your child or teen has a phone, trying to help them to sort of, which I know is easier said than done, trying to see the value and not having it next to them unless they really need it for work. If you find that your child or teen really needs it for schoolwork, or they're refusing to put it away and claim they're using it for work, one way to kind of create a boundary would be to have the phone in a different position when they're using it for school. So for example, maybe putting it in some sort of dock, like for example, like something like this. And you could use a Bluetooth keyboard. So the idea is when they're using it for school, it's in a different position. So it kind of gets them to think about what they're doing with it rather than just using it the same way they normally do. So, in some cases that can help with minimizing the use of the phone if it has to be out, to only use it for school stuff. One of the other big things that can be really helpful are using programs if necessary to block access to websites, programs, other things that can be distracting. Because with a computer, it's really easy to just go on to something else, while you're supposed to be doing homework or even during class time. I mean, countless kids go on and play all sorts of games during class time, or chat with friends. There's so much that can be done because everything's right in front of you. So the idea is, if you can get your child or teen to recognize that they're really having a hard time with this, and if they want the help, then working with them on setting up a program like Cold Turkey or Freedom can be really helpful. And what these programs do is you can go in and block certain websites during specific times. So this way they can't even access certain stuff. So it basically prevents it from even being sort of a temptation during those times. Like especially for older teens, I work a lot with having them kind of set it up themselves, or set up with me. So this way, they're the one, they ultimately are in control of what they're blocking and the times. And for some kids that works really well because they don't feel like they're being forced to do it, and so they in turn are more receptive to using it. There are also some Google Chrome extensions you can use, like Dayboard, mindful browsing, that do a lot of those types of things too, that kind of remind you, like one of them says, do you really want to go on to that? This is your to-do list. Do you really want to open up that page? So sometimes it just gets you, even if it doesn't actually block anything, it just gets you to think and pause. And for some people, that extra moment of thinking, oh, should I really be doing this, allows them in turn to be able to follow through better. Okay, so harnessing fidgeting. So this is one of my favorite things. So it's interesting because, for example, a lot of kids that have ADHD or sometimes with anxiety, a lot will kind of bounce around a lot, have a hard time sitting still. Whether they're shaking their hands, or you can't see us because it's only the top up, but tapping their feet. There's a lot that people end up doing, and sometimes it can be very distracting, or in some cases really annoy other people, especially in person. But in any event, what's really cool is you can actually trick your mind into thinking you're more interested in something than you are by harnessing the fidgeting, and so doing controlled movement. And so there's a lot that you can do if you find that your child or teen fidgets, which in turn you can kind of use that to help them in turn to focus better. So for example, I'm sure a lot of you probably have heard of a fidget spinner. This is, unfortunately, the fidget spinner is a horrible example of a fidget device. Quite frankly, I think they were mismarketed, because I think they were initially marketed for anxiety, which maybe it helps because it takes your mind off stuff, but they're so distracting because you have to look down to play with it that it's not really helpful for staying focused. So the idea with a fidget, and whether you use it hand or feet, is that you want to maintain your full eye contact with what's going on. You don't want to be looking at. So for example, let's see. So if I'm looking at, I don't know, let's say this. So if I'm looking at this, I'm looking down, clearly, even if I'm fully listening, I'm missing whatever visual stuff's being presented. So it's not very helpful. However, if I'm holding the fidget down here, I'm still looking fully. My full eye contact's being maintained. I'm not actually thinking about playing with the globe ball. And in turn, it can actually be helpful. Like with these things, these are things that are probably not, like you don't want to just implement them just for the sake of implementing them. You want to identify that if there's an issue with moving around a lot, hitting lots of buttons on the computer because you're fidgeting, I don't know, throwing a pencil up in the air. You want to, like, if those issues are occurring, then you want to work in either a hand fidget or a feet fidget. With the feet fidget, these are interesting. So, I mean, with online school, there's a lot more you can actually do than you normally could during normal school for this. And so, for example, things that you can do, or if you have a child that's just doesn't like sitting still, and it's not so much of a fidgeting issue, you could use a desk bike or elliptical. Like for example, so this is a desk bike. So basically, it's obviously pretty compact. It sits under the desk, And so the idea is you're probably not going to get a good quality workout while you're in school, but the idea is at least just to be moving. So, they make this version. There's so this is the elliptical version. And this is a Stairmaster version. So, and these are meant, you can use these all sitting. Obviously, some of them you could use standing, and obviously a standing desk is another option. But the idea really is, in most cases, if you're sitting in class, basically by doing this, the idea is you're able to do it pretty discreetly so no one's really noticing. So, for example, I just started pedaling right now on the elliptical. I don't know, you might see me move very slightly, but I have a feeling you probably, unless I said it, probably would not have noticed that I'm currently pedaling on an elliptical. In terms of some other ideas, so we have a balance board, can be kind of another thing that can be great, whether you're sitting or standing. That can be great just to get a little bit of movement in. We have inflatable foot pedals that you kind of just can inflate to different sort of, I guess, thicknesses or how hard or soft they are, and just kind of push down a little bit. Other things, these you might have seen, but these are fairly common in schools, but basically bands that you put on a chair. This version is called a kick band, or this brand. You basically just put it on the front of the chair and you can kind of push down or pull up. So there's a fair amount of stuff that you can do with it. And then another idea, show you one more, is a wobble cushion. So this one's kind of cool because you can put it on your feet or you can sit on it. If you sit on it, you actually have to almost move slightly to hold still. So it actually gives you a little bit of a natural movement in, and by moving slightly, you actually end up sitting still. It's also probably a pretty good core workout as well. But the idea really is to introduce these things if you need to, but to try to make it where it just becomes something natural that you do, whereas you don't want to turn into a toy, because at that point then it doesn't become so helpful. The other thing you can also do are, using certain timers or programs to remind yourself to stay on task, or your child to stay on task. So if you have a child that zones out pretty quickly, they could use like a vibrating watch or an app that basically gives either a brief chime or a vibration at set times, like let's say every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. It's kind of like the high-tech way of a parent jolting you to say, get back on task. But what's great about it is that it's basically a tool that your child can use as they grow up. It's not that they're not going to have to take you to college with them to remind them to stay on task. It's something that ultimately, in one form or another, they could use long-term themselves. With the vibrating watch as an example, Watchminder is one particular brand. Some kids find them really helpful. Some kids find them extremely annoying. So, some of this is also personal preference, and unfortunately a little bit of trial and error to sort of figure out, which particular things will work for your child. Obviously, taking breaks is also really important for a variety of reasons. The other thing, though, is that for some kids, if you take a break, especially let's say doing homework and your child says, oh, let me take a break. What does that actually mean? Does that mean I'm going to take 10 minutes? Does that mean I'm going to go roam around the internet and then whenever I feel like I go back to work? The idea is with a break, you probably want to have it planned out and have an actual time limit and actually set a timer. Because if you don't have a time limit, it's a lot harder to kind of stick to a break. One caveat to that is that if you have a set activity, so if you say, I'm going to run 2 laps around the backyard and then I'm going to get back to work, that's time limited because there's a definitive endpoint. So in that regard, I think it's okay not to necessarily use a timer, but otherwise it's good to use a timer to get yourself back on task. In terms of study skills, I just put a couple of ideas here. And I can also, if anyone wants, I can definitely send out slides after. But basically, the idea with study skills is that you want to break down whatever activities you're going to do to study into very tangible pieces. Because even if you block out in a schedule time to study for, let's say, history exam, what does that actually mean? A lot of kids may just review their notes or, may blow off studying because they don't actually know how to get started and what to do. So by basically writing out a plan when a child first gets notice of an exam, whether it's sort of looking at flashcards or making a list of key terms and definitions, having like a tangible task to do each day and treating like a homework assignment will help kind of spread out the studying so you're not cramming and allow them to more actively use the material to make it easier to learn it better. I like to think about studying as kind of a three-phase approach. So phase one is kind of gathering materials, preparing study tools, kind of getting organized. Phase two is really using active study tools. So this means, having someone quiz you, answering practice questions, writing stuff down. But the key though is to use your notes, because I think a lot of times people get too focused on trying to memorize stuff so quickly. And the problem is by trying to memorize it too quickly, you learn it in a very narrow way. And so by actively using the material, you kind of naturally end up memorizing it without really planning to. And so it makes studying a lot easier, because if, let's say, your child keeps rereading their notes, they may know the material in the exact same way it's presented in the notes. But let's say the teacher, presents it differently. Unless they truly understand the material, it's probably going to be a lot harder to answer the questions accurately on the exam. The third phase is more of your typical kind of studying without notes, towards the end. But again, I think using active tools to practice answering questions and doing things besides rereading the notes can be really helpful. Over here, I gave some other examples on study tools. So Quizlet is a great one, making flashcards, and think outside the box sometimes. So maybe, have a child or teen teach you a lesson on material related to the exam. Chances are, if they can teach the material well enough to you, especially if you had no idea what they're talking about beforehand, probably, and you can understand it, probably they know the material at that point then, I would guess. There's a lot that you can do. And so it's important to try these things out, because it'll be really helpful now. And, again, the type of exams may be a little bit different while your child's doing school online. If it's more application based because everything's open notes, or maybe it's, multiple choice because it's easier for the teacher to grade. It depends on maybe the teacher, but the point is, you may have to adjust these some based on how the material is presented for exams, but these are things that are going to be really helpful long term. Okay, and then I just put an example here of a study plan. So, phase one for a world studies test is just, making a study guide and making the flashcards. So kind of the preparation part. Phase two is the idea of, reviewing the online materials and having someone quiz you. So the idea of, again, using the material actively, but also using your notes, not trying to rely on your memory from the start. And then phase three is, more of the typical, having someone quiz you, looking over things, doing it without your notes to kind of make sure you really know the material well. Okay, and a couple of strategies for just improving academic skills in general. So, with reading comprehension and note taking, this is something like I'm sure a lot of kids probably have heard this. You should take notes on reading. A lot really just either have no idea how to do it or just think, oh, it's going to be a waste of time. But so a couple of kind of strategies that will actually save kids a lot of time in the long run and make it a lot easier to better understand what you're reading. So the main thing is, for, let's say, textbooks, if a child or teen writes out the headings before they start reading, and then pauses after each section to write a few bullet points, what that does is it allows them to not have to keep starting and stopping. Because if a child just tries to take notes randomly, they're going to keep starting and stopping. That's going to slow them down a lot, and they're probably going to be less focused and lose interest in writing notes, or just not find it helpful. Whereas basically by reading a section and then pausing, it actually allows them to process what they've read, and then writing out the few bullet points helps them to really solidify what they just read. And if they have absolutely no idea what they just read, they stop themselves before they've read the whole chapter and have to go reread the whole thing again. With let's say a novel like for English, for example, making a template for each book of main characters, key events, themes, and kind of filling it out as they go along can be really helpful, because it gives them a lot more information to work with when it comes time to, let's say, write a paper. And with reading, especially if you have kids that have a hard time staying focused, using a program that reads the book to you while you're viewing it can be really helpful. Like for some kids, they like listening to an audiobook, but the issue with the audiobook is that if it's just the audio piece, sometimes they may lose focus, but sometimes by seeing it and hearing it, and a lot of these programs will also highlight the word as it's read, so it keeps a nice visual cue that keeps you keeps the child or teen on task better in really being able to kind of maximize their focus, which in turn can improve their comprehension. Mercury Reader is kind of a cool Google Chrome extension. So what that does is it allows you to basically control the font, the background, and some other stuff if you have to read stuff on the computer, which given online learning, a lot of kids are reading stuff on the computer a lot these days, as are adults. So what's great is it gets rid of extraneous information, if there's ads, all sorts of, or just like lots of things that are not related to whatever you're reading. So it makes it a lot easier just to kind of get a nice clean page to kind of read what you need to read. In terms of math, there's a couple kind of quick strategies. So, in some cases, if you have a child or teen that gets themselves kind of lost because they have messy handwriting and can't keep the steps organized, or it's just a big jumble on a piece of paper, in some cases, having them separate steps into boxes can help keep them better organized. And also sometimes creating an example of a problem that they did correctly and annotating it so they understand kind of in plain English, step by step, what they did. That in turn might make it easier to understand going forward, what they're supposed to do. Because I think sometimes with math, especially, kids end up, in some cases, kind of going through the motions and kind of having a sense of what to do, or maybe they sort of get it in the moment with the homework, but they don't truly understand it. So the problem is once they go on to the next unit, they forget it, and then they never really have solidified a true understanding of what they're actually supposed to be doing, which then becomes a real problem when they have to are expected to know the information on the next exam. In terms of writing, a couple of ideas that could be helpful are talking out ideas or free writing before organizing ideas. Because for a lot of kids, if they have trouble getting started in writing, basically helping them to just get some ideas out will then make it easier to then make a more of a plan, like an outline or use a graphic organizer. Whereas sometimes if people try to start with an outline without fully fleshing out what they actually want to write about, it makes it a lot harder. Other things that can be helpful are using headings when writing a draft. So if you have a child or teen that just gets stuck, feel like, oh, I have to make this perfectly. I have to get this to, connect perfectly for me to continue on to next part. That's can save them in that situation by allowing them to write a paper in sections and then go back later and either, take out the headings and write more transition parts, or, maybe in some cases leave some of the headings in. Okay, so these are just kind of pretty much, I think, all or most of the different technology pieces that I mentioned earlier tonight. And so what we've done, so in terms of, we still definitely have plenty of time left. This is kind of a quick run through of stuff. I'm more than happy to kind of answer questions and kind of get a discussion going if people are interested in terms of questions to be helpful in this.
I have a question. We have two middle schoolers who are in MCPS virtual learning. And one of the things that struck me that you were talking about was studying for tests and having them read their notes, et cetera, as one of the sort of steps. At least that I have seen in MCPS, and I don't even know that it's because of virtual, I just think it's MCPS maybe in general, they don't learn how to take notes. And maybe it's just middle school and they get there at some point, but that is not a skill that they have been taught. And is that something we should be trying to teach them at home? Because right now they get slides, right? And in virtual, there's not even any real test or quiz taking. It's, they get it and they can look back at the slides, but that sort of memorization component and testing that seems to have gone by the wayside.
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting point. Obviously, I'm sure there are some schools that do teach a lot of study skills, but a lot of times I do see kids, it doesn't, contrary to what you would think given at school, I think a lot of times kids don't really get taught a lot of good study strategies, or certainly not anything in depth. It's, maybe sort of piecemeal. The teacher may say, oh, use this or use that. But, I think that is something that is very helpful, either at home to teach your kids or, have them take a class of some kind, but something to kind of teach them study skills will, make a huge difference, for a lot of kids in the future.
Thank you.
Welcome.
If I can just follow up on that, do you know of any resources locally where children could take a class or how to help them, how to either help parents teach their kids those study skills or where to help them develop that?
Yeah, let's see. There's a place called the Study Pro in McLean that does a bunch of study skills classes. There's Paul Revis has a study skills course. Like a lot of the tutoring companies also offer various like 8 sessions, 6, whatever it is, study skills, based on certain topics. There's a lot out there. but those are a couple offhand I can think of. For some reason, I can't see the chat box. I don't know if so, but is there anything in any question in the chat box I should be aware of?
No questions, just requests for the slides when we're done.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm definitely happy to share those. Do you want me to? Should I send those to you, Joe? Is that the easiest way?
I'll send them out. Yeah. Any other questions, either slides or you feel free to unmute?
I have a question.
Sure. Go ahead.
This is a very interesting presentation. Thank you for sharing your ideas. If you have a student who's doing well in school, but is very disorganized and heading off to college, any suggestions for that student? So they've been able to cope well with that disorganization up to now, through high school, but
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely good to work on it before college, because I think that even if a lot of kids that have kind of kept it together in high school, college is often very different, because it's not just about the school; it's also about the life skills of just remembering to do laundry, changing your sheets, getting yourself, remembering to fill out the right forms to make sure you have housing. So I think basically like trying to help your child or your teen rather, if they're willing to set up simple systems of some sort of like a checklist, or using a calendar, like little things like that, and then give them some autonomy, especially during their senior year, but do it in a way where they sort of have a safety net. So if something happens and they miss something, that you're able to kind of at least remind them of it, so that they don't completely blow whatever it is.
Are there any books that you would recommend that that are kind of suited to that age level to kind of help them identify their own techniques for being independent, organized?
Let me think. There's you mean so for your son to read directly?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I mean, there are a few I've read that might be good. There's one, Enhancing Executive Functioning, that is really meant for teens to kind of use themselves. That's one. I mean, there may be some work, but the problem, I feel like there's not as much out there as you would think, for teens themselves for this type of stuff. In some ways, even I would say, if you identify what he even sometimes articles, just find attitudemag.com or chad.org oftentimes have a lot of articles of, here's how to kind of get ready for college. Here's how you create a checklist.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. Because a lot of times, kids unfortunately don't really have a long attention span to read a really long book.
So here's one question. Someone was curious about where to be able to get the inflatable feet cushions.
Okay.
They already have the seat cushion. They want the feet one now.
That one I got off on Amazon. Pretty much, I think everything I showed you, I ordered from Amazon. That was definitely an easier question to answer. But yeah, I mean, it's if you just type in, type in desk bike or other search terms into Amazon, you get kind of a nice array of things, or feet fidget. Just, you got a lot that comes up and kind of just see what's out there. I mean, sometimes I just search and I'll, find new stuff I didn't even know existed. I mean, the nice thing is a lot of these things are also not that expensive. I mean, some of the bands are, $5 or $10. Some of the fidgets, for example, on Amazon, you can buy, where is the, basically a huge pack of fidgets for, this is $12 maybe or something. I think that was without the Black Friday special. So a lot of times it's, because it's to some degree trial and error, it's good to just, get a couple different things and sort of try a few things out and see what works. And same thing, even just thinking about a chair, especially for younger kids, think about what kind of chair is your child sitting in. That, if you have a chair and there is a thing that spins or wheels and they're moving around constantly, that in itself can make it harder to stay focused. Sometimes for some kids, they like a yoga ball chair, that can be kind of a good one. I think you can actually see, I have on the background, I'm sure, in case anyone doesn't have any idea what they look like. But those are great because you can still get a little bit of movement in, but you're not going to roll away like you would just sitting on a yoga ball.
Any other questions? Any final thoughts from you?
I mean, I would say, obviously each child is different or teen is different. So I think you have to figure out, what's going to work for your child or teen. I think, trying a couple strategies, but I think also sometimes offering them ideas, but not forcing on them can make a huge difference. So instead of going home and saying, you have to do this, you have to do that, say, here's something you could use. Or sometimes by incorporating stuff into your daily. So for example, if you want your child or teen to use a calendar more, by creating, let's say, a family Google Calendar and, adding events to it that they have access to, it just kind of can make it more natural for them to start using things for themselves. And I would say the areas I didn't mention it, but Amazon Alexa or Google Home can be a really great strategy for reminders. Being able to, have them, set reminders for different things, or like whether it's, school related or chores. My 5-year-old sets it to, remember to change our dog's food each morning. And obviously that could have fairly significant consequences if he doesn't do it. I mean, granted, we also check to make sure he did it. But, the idea is that, even kids really young can use some of these strategies. And by helping them incorporate into their daily lives at a young age, it can be really helpful in kind of helping them to use it themselves long term.
Well, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I really appreciate it. And I know that everyone who was on here also does. And again, I want to really, again, express my appreciation for you taking the time to help us with all this. I know we're all trying to explore, all these different avenues as we're trying to still figure out what life is still like during these times, and with the uncertainty, and trying to make the best of these situations. And so I appreciate your help with that.